Great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar today. We're delighted to have you here with us. I'm Michelle Koffenberger, the Deputy Director of Research for the RISE program, and it's wonderful to have you all here with us today. So the RISE program, which stands for Research on Improving Systems of Education, is a multi-year, multi-country research endeavor dedicated to investigating how low and middle income countries can overcome the learning crisis through system-level improvements. And in today's webinar, we will hear what we've learned about education systems and improving learning outcomes over the past 8 years worth of research. Just a quick housekeeping note. So there will be time for Q&A towards the end of the webinar. So as you listen to the presentation, do put your questions and comments in the Q&A function. You'll find it at the bottom there, and we will field those during the dedicated Q&A time after the presentation. The chat's available as well to make comments, but for questions that you want addressed to the panelists, please do use the Q&A function for those. And with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our chair for today's event. So we have with us Professor Charlotte Watts, who is the Chief Scientific Advisor and Director for Research and Evidence in the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. She is seconded from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where she is Professor of Social and Mathematical Epidemiology. Professor Watts is a global expert in violence prevention with a distinguished record of using science and evidence to achieve impact. Her work on tackling gender-based and domestic violence is widely recognized, notably in the 2019 Queen's Birthday Honors. Professor Watts will open our event, facilitate some questions after the presentation, and share remarks as well. So thank you, Professor Watts, for being with us today. And with that, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. And can I add my warm welcome to everybody who's joining today. It's a real pleasure to be with you and to chair this final RISE webinar. So for FCDO and for the United Kingdom, global education continues to be a major development priority, working towards our commitment to contribute to getting 40 million more girls in school and 20 million more girls reading by the age of 10 by 2026. We're committed to working together with partners to improve foundational learning for all children globally. This is not only a good in and of itself, but also an essential part of our wider development ambition that spans many areas, including in health, women's empowerment, and poverty alleviation. The scale of the challenge to improve foundational learning equally requires solutions at scale and an understanding of how education systems work, why they fail to deliver even foundational levels of learning, and how they can be reformed. The RISE program has played a vital role over the last 8 years, not only in delivering rigorous evidence on precisely these questions, but also in providing the thought leadership, expertise, and partnerships to shift the conversation on education, and also to deliver tangible impacts on policy and practice. It is these two factors that have driven the success of RISE. Firstly, the commitment to high quality research and intellectual rigor delivered by a hugely impressive team of researchers and academics. The breadth and scale of RISE's outputs is striking, as is the range of methodologies used and the depth of conceptual thinking. Influence of this work is undeniable, not only in terms of numbers of academic citations and journal articles, but also in the way in which RISE research has become a mainstay and yardstick for global education evidence. Secondly, the hard work and capacity of the RISE consortium to communicate clearly, develop strong partnerships, and cultivate wider networks has been equally important, allowing the program to engage and influence at many different levels. In the last 5 years, there's been scarcely a major education report or initiative that hasn't been shaped by the thinking and work coming out of the RISE program. From the 2018 World Development Report on Education and DFID's own 2018 Education Policy, to the reports of the Global Education Evidence Advisory Panel and last year's Transforming Education Summit and Commitment to Action on Foundational Learning. The impact of the program is not only intellectual, but tangible. Some of the most striking examples come from where RISE has worked with national governments to address the learning losses that resulted from the COVID pandemic, shaping back to school policies in Ethiopia, co-designing target instruction programs in Pakistan, and influencing teacher training in Jakarta. RISE has been striking for successfully bringing together researchers and research institutes from across the world in a single but many-headed endeavour, and combining this development of a global RISE identity with strong national research agendas and close collaborations with national governments and stakeholders. The RISE conference has become a highlight of the global education research calendar and a key venue for linking together researchers and sharing the latest evidence with a wider network. The development of the RISE community of practice has also been a remarkable achievement. It now comprises of over 100 organizations from 30 countries from across 6 continents and brings together individuals from NGOs, civil society, think tanks, research institutes, philanthropies, and global development partners to focus energy and efforts on addressing the learning crisis. So in a moment, I'll hand over to Dr. Pritchett for his presentation, which will focus on what he views as the most important findings and impactful papers produced by the program. But I want to acknowledge from FCDO and practitioner perspective, the importance and usefulness of the tools and diagnostics that RISE has produced, and that are now being taken up by education advisors from FCDO as they work with partner governments around the world. These are an important part of what the RISE legacy and the continued influence of the program will be achieving in the education work. So to end, FCDO are proud to have supported the work of RISE and enabled this remarkable set of achievements. And while I'm privileged to speak here, I also want to acknowledge the important contributions of both the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in funding and supporting the program along with us. Towards the end of this webinar, I'll also say a brief word on how we will be supporting the continued impact of RISE beyond the end of the program. So with that, a huge thank you again for joining, and I'm delighted to hand over to Dr. Pritchett for his presentation. Over to you, Lant.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. If we could start the slides. So, and I think both Michelle and Charlotte's introduction have illustrated the challenge that one has in trying to do a 50-minute presentation on 8 years of research. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, there we go. Next slide. So the origin of RISE was that there has been a long-standing tension within the global education community on the tension between schooling, just the process of children being in a physical building called a school, and education, children acquiring the skills, the talents, the capabilities, the capacities, as well as the values and beliefs and dispositions that we hope that modern schooling can equip children to be adults in their society. The tension was that there needed to be access. Children needed to be in school in order to learn, but there was also increasing concern as of 2012 when the program began to emerge into existence that there needed to be a shift in the global education discourse because the world had been radically successful in some ways in getting every child into school, but there were increasing concerns that the goals of education that were laid out and as human rights as early as 1948 and followed by a series of communiques and declarations and goals just were not being adequately met. Next slide. That led to the RISE program, and people have described it, but in purple are sort of the support functions, and in blue are the various ways in which we produced research. So it was truly a multidisciplinary, multi-country, multi-strand research project with 7 country research teams, 2 political economy teams looking at how the politics of both adoption and implementation. We had a research directorate that supported this as well as producing original research. We had an intellectual leadership team that again supported the direction of the program as well as producing original research. And we also have drawn on RISE fellows. So I'm intending to summarize in 50 minutes or less this massive project. Next slide. That has, as we've said, produced just far too many individually stellar research outputs to make a simple sort of synthesis. If you say, what has RISE found? How do you synthesize, over 200 individually original research projects, as well as many attempts to synthesize that, as well as Charlotte pointed out, the tools and diagnostics. So there are essentially 3 strands to RISE. One is the output, one is the engagement, one is the tools and techniques that we move on. So next slide. So all of this is an integral part of RISE, but I just want to focus on 10 individual studies that have been deeply influential on my own personal thinking. Coming into being the research director of RISE in 2014, I had already written a book on education. I had written many academic papers on education. I was a reasonably, if not a reasonably conversant person on the RISE research. And so I just want to talk about 10 individual papers that I think illustrate the reason why research is important. And the reason research is important is that we learn new stuff. So next slide. Next slide. And I just want to start with, there's some builds in this. There's a general Bayesian approach, if not formally Bayesian, that we update our beliefs. That the point of research is that we have certain beliefs about the world, and we have the, in some sense, precision or security with which we hold those beliefs. So some things we think we know, but we're not really sure. Some things we know for sure. Some things we know, but turn out to be false. And so to me, the reason we, in some sense, do research is to update our knowledge and beliefs, and hopefully we get to more accurate and more useful sets of beliefs. And a paradigm, next, there's a build in this slide. So next click. The paradigm for me in some ways is an experiment done in the UK, the Rutherford gold foiled experiment, where they were trying to investigate the structure of the atom, and they fired at a very thin sheet of gold these supermassive particles, and they had a background. They were seeing how do they get deflected, and we'll try and understand the structure of the atom by seeing how the structure of the atom deflects these massive particles as they pass through this very thin gold foil. And what happened was some of the heavy, massive particles bounced back. So rather than going through the foil and hitting the screen behind, some of them bounced back in ways that were just completely, totally unexpected. It's sometimes described as if you took a howitzer, fired it at a piece of facial tissue, and the howitzer shell bounced back at you. That was just required a radical reshaping of our understanding of the structure of the atom, because all of a sudden a whole array of previously entertained beliefs about the structure of the atom were just inconsistent with the evidence. So I'm hoping to present 10 pieces of RISE research that, for me at least, had really striking findings that really need to be incorporated in the way we currently understand the world and the global system, the systems of education. So next slide. The first of these was a paper done with Alexis Nestor and Laura Moskovitz and Justin Sendifor, who was originally one of the RISE Research Directorate. And what they did is they took demographic and health survey data that have had various waves over time. And in those, women are asked if they can read a simple passage in a language of their choosing. So there's cards with a sentence in whatever language the woman might choose to read it. And they just ask these women if they can read it. And then what we can do is we can look at the likelihood a woman who has completed 5 years of schooling can read or not. And then you can actually trace that with various birth cohorts of women. Now, what they found was two striking things. One, the likelihood a woman with 5 years of education can read a single simple sentence has actually declined substantially over the last 40 to 50 years. Prior to this study, we honestly had almost no long-term historical trajectory of learning. And so this in and of itself was quite striking. We just had striking because we had no idea. We had no idea if it had been stagnant. We knew the current levels because we could do lots of surveys today, but we didn't know whether those current levels represented a slow upward trend, a stagnant trend, or a downward trend. And for about 60% of the countries, the likelihood of an adult woman with 5 years of schooling could read had declined. And so on average, it was about 10 percentage points. What was even more striking was the radical kind of differences across countries. So, for instance, if we just take two countries, Vietnam and Zambia, and what the arrows display is on the horizontal axis, the likelihood a woman had completed schooling. So in both countries, the enrollment and attainment of women had expanded enormously, moving towards nearly 100% of women getting to at least grade 5, which is the success of enrollment we're talking about. But what you saw is that Vietnam, actually the fraction of women with grade 5 complete had gone way up by about 20 percentage points. But the fraction of women who with grade 5 complete, who could read, had gone spectacularly, tragically down in Zambia by almost 30 percentage points. So we knew that there were large differences currently between Zambia and Vietnam. What we didn't know is that these large differences were largely a result of things that have happened since 1950. So if you look at the gap in the likelihood a woman could read having completed grade 5, in the 1950s cohort, women who would have been started into their education in the early 1960s, there was only a 10 percentage point gap in whether or not women could read, and that has emerged into a 70 percentage point gap. So what we didn't know is that the huge differences today between Zambia and Vietnam are the result of processes in the way these two systems have evolved over the last 40 years. Again, striking results that we just didn't have any way at getting at these long-term historical trends until we realized we could use the repeated cross-sections of women to eke out the trends. So very important, because we need to understand not why countries just are where they are today, but why they have been on these radically different trajectories, both of which have seen massive expansions in enrollment, and on average there's been massive expansion of enrollment. That's the first study. I'm going through them very fast. Second study. Next slide. Is the OECD has been doing the PISA study, which assesses children around the world at age 15 who are enrolled in school on a variety of learning tasks around literacy, numeracy, and science knowledge. And one of the big questions that we just didn't have very precise answers to was how much of the gap from the current Sustainable Development Goal for minimum levels of learning could be eliminated by eliminating inequalities across students along certain observable dimensions like sex, rural residence, language at home, and socioeconomic status. We know all of those things affect student outcomes, but we just didn't know by how much, and we didn't know by how much relative to where were. And so a co-author, Martina Villarengo, and myself, we analyzed the PISA-D data, and what we show is that there are, in fact, huge inequalities within countries, that students who come from low socioeconomic status households are 39 PISA points behind hope I'm getting this right. I wrote this paper, but I still have to look at the numbers. Yeah, are 39 points behind the advantaged students. So there is a gradient. Advantaged students do better. But if we look at the average level of the advantaged students who are male, urban residents, speak the language of instruction at home, non-migrants, and who are the socioeconomic elite, they are 43 PISA points behind the SDG minimum. So the striking fact is the elites in these 6 PISA D countries are substantially behind even getting to the minimum level of learning. So even if we eliminated all of the inequalities within these countries would still have results in which very few students are meeting the SDG minimum level of learning. And we see that this is not a necessary consequence of poverty, because when we look at Vietnam and look at equivalent students between, say, Zambia and Vietnam, so equivalent in the sense they have the same measured sex, they're measured urban residents, same measured socioeconomic status by the indicator that the PISA-D has, we find that students in Zambia that are equivalent on all these other dimensions are 233 points behind students in Vietnam. What this tells us for sure is it is not the disadvantage of the children that is resulting in their very low learning levels. It's something about the system of education with it that they are attending school within, and the system of education can make essentially all of the difference. So all of the advantaged elite in Vietnam are well above the PISA threshold. Nearly all of the advantaged elite in Zambia is below it for reasons that aren't characteristics of the students, but must in some sense be characteristics of the education they're exposed to. So that again is a key finding in how we think about fixing the system, as we realize we have to fix the system even for the elites. Even the elites are being exposed to very weak teaching and learning practices and ending up with, on global levels, less than adequate learning levels. Next slide. Yeah. The third thing, a third study, and these are just not in order of priority or quality, just in the order I think makes some sequence, because we're talking about what did we learn about learning levels and how they evolve. A third piece of research came from Indonesia that used household survey data from an ongoing panel called the Indonesian Family Life Survey that's been maintained for almost, I think, 30 years in Indonesia. And it asks some simple primary level arithmetic questions. So, and from those simple arithmetic questions, you can look at the level of learning students have. And when they looked at this, they found 2 quite striking things. First, they found that these associations of competence over primary school arithmetic are quite flat after a certain point. So kids do, in fact, in Indonesia gain learning over these, but it then peters out at actually a very low level. The average of students who had completed grade 12 in Indonesia in 2014, only about a third of them could add fractions, add a simple fraction. So it isn't this is petering out at very high levels of mastery. This is petering out at, in fact, very low levels of even simple arithmetic operations. So essentially a child in 11th grade only still has roughly the mastery they had in 7th grade. So these 4 additional years of schooling just aren't contributing to increased mastery at the same pace they were. So this relationship is very concave, which has enormous implications for how we think about improving learning outcomes by putting more kids through school. Because obviously if kids are attending more school and aren't expanding their mastery, we're not achieving expanding their total capabilities as they leave school. The second striking finding from this was that the learning profile had actually shifted inward over time. So at any given grade, children knew less in 2014 than they knew in the year 2000. So over the 14-year period, for whatever complicated dynamic of the evolution of the system, and by the way, this is a system in a country where there was rapid economic growth, a rapid, very rapid expansion of spending per pupil over this period, at least doubled. But over that period, an 8th grader in 2014 only had the same competence in these primary school arithmetic operations as a 4th grader did in 2000. So somehow the pace of learning, rather than expanding and accelerating so that children knew more per grade, had been shifting inwards by a quite substantial amount. And the net consequence of this is over the period 2000 to 2014, there was this very sizable expansion of schooling completed. And yet, if you looked at what did youth who had recently emerged from school, what were they able to do in terms of arithmetic competencies, their total competency had shrunk rather than grown. So we had expanded schooling with no effect, in fact, negative effect on the total learning capability of youth, which is obviously very worrisome. And again, this is something, the shape of this profile is not something one can elicit from the standard approaches of assessment of children of a given age or grade. And the dynamics over time requires comparability over time. So again, this was a very shocking finding to me and to others because we just had no idea that Indonesia, a country that in many ways was making rapid progress, was having this deteriorating learning profile. So next slide. So the next study was a study in which that followed carefully the implementation at scale of a promising program that had worked and been implemented in other countries of school improvement plans. And what the school improvement plans did is they tried to reorient. This was an attempt of the system to reorient itself towards improving learning by asking each school to do a diagnostic. So each school was meant to do a diagnostic of its own conditions and its own challenges in improving learning. It was then to formulate a school-specific plan for addressing those deficiencies. And then the support structure of the government and of the schooling system, the supervision, so all of the levels of the system above the school were then intended to be reoriented towards helping the schools improve their own school improvement plan. This was, again, a technically well-designed, the sort of overall theory of change made a ton of sense. As the state of Madhya Pradesh in India rolled this out, it was accompanied by the RISE country team for India doing a randomized controlled experiment where they kept track of, they rolled it out in a way that district by district, so some districts got it, some districts didn't, that they could actually track what was the impact on the schools adopting this new intervention versus all other schools. Now, the really striking thing about this study is that the first step of doing the school improvement diagnostic and plan had complete compliance. So the big orange bar shows you that roughly 90% of the schools, in fact, were compliant with the intent of the program of creating a diagnostic and plan. The tragedy is that after these school improvement diagnostic and plans, nothing else happened. Nothing changed. The supervision resources and the inspection resources, intensity and content of the way in which the inspector system supported didn't change at all. So there was no change in an inspection visit. The inspection visits were supposed to help them work through and implement the plan. There was no change in teacher attendance, which is a chronic problem in India, of the reliability of teacher attendance. And therefore, not surprisingly, and there were lots of other measures measured in this study. We're just showing you two of the key measures that reflect whether or not there was actual behavioral responses at the school or above school level. And then not surprisingly, given that nothing changed, student learning didn't change at all. So the reason why I think this is such a Bayesian shock kind of study is that if you had not done the RCT the program easily would have been thought to be a big success because they did in fact achieve this marker of having schools do a diagnostic, and the diagnostic tended to have informational content. It wasn't just boilerplate. They actually did a diagnostic and they had a plan. It's just in the way in which the system worked, that plan couldn't realize itself into change in behavior. So I think it revealed important things about the conditions for implementation of education programs, about the need to adapt the programs that are kind of transplanted and have been successful everywhere to local conditions, to where you ask, are they really capable of implementing this? Next slide. Another study that was also carried out in India was an embedded evaluation in which a think tank in India actually had people embedded in the schools that were implementing a new instructional approach that was launched by the Delhi government in the schools they controlled. Now, the thing that makes, in my mind, this study so interesting is that many times when we look at the implementation of new reforms, we believe that they don't succeed because there isn't adequate political will. And I was going to use scare quotes with my fingers, never quite sure what people mean by political will. But in this case, a party that was brand new to India had won the elections and controlled parts of Delhi. Part of Delhi is controlled by the federal government, but part is controlled by an elective government. And this was the only jurisdiction in India this party controlled. And this party only had two essential agenda items: education and corruption. So it was absolutely a primordial commitment of this new government that they succeed on education. So this is a nice case study, because it's like, we know for sure there was all of the political will in the world. The number two in the party, who was also the Minister of Finance, was also personally responsible for and engaged in implementing this. So all the political will in the world. Then the question is, can you translate that into change behaviors and practices in instruction that are going to be more effective? And they were adopting like what we call, and broadly, teaching at the right level. So they were adapting, since the Delhi government only controlled the fifth and sixth grade, or sixth and they only controlled upper primary. Many children were coming into upper primary without any fundamental literacy skills. So this was a attempt to modify the teaching so that you could bring school students up to having foundational literacy and numeracy where they lacked it coming into these upper primary schools. So we believe that the program had all the political will to be implemented, and we believed that the program, if implemented, could have big impacts, because we think it was based on a pedagogically sound vision of what needed to happen. One of the deep things, and so at the same time, this think tank was tracing out implementation of the project over the course of 3 years, with individual research literally showing up every day, every day at the school to see what was happening in the school. So it was a qualitative, extended study that started from the very beginning of the implementation. So I don't know if there's quite, oftentimes we try and evaluate reforms after they're ongoing or after they've been completed. So one of the many sort of deep insights from this embedded evaluation was the difficulty the government had in communicating with, there was a certain grammar of the state. The way the Indian state communicated its objectives and plans was to send directives. And these directives tended to be directive. And so they were trying to create a sense that the teachers were empowered, that the teachers were autonomous, that the teachers were valued, that the teachers were important, that they needed these teachers to, change their behavioral practices in order to achieve these learning objectives. And at the same time, the only instrument they had to communicate this was an instrument of thou shalt and thou must, and it is mandatory that. And so there were two things I think really important to learn. Is one, it's very difficult for a state to change the way it communicates in a way that truly transmit messages that need to happen for more greater empowerment and autonomy of people doing implementation. The second is that another great thing this study did is by being there, they kept track of every single directive that was received by the schools. And they did this linguistic analysis of each of those directives. But the second thing they learned is that the people sort of running the reform were sending lots of directives, but so was everybody else. So the pipeline of directives just got bigger. It didn't reprioritize. So every morning the principal shows up, there's some directives from his higher ups in the bureaucratic administration, and some of them were about implementing this new innovative pedagogical approach, but many of them were routine things that she was also responsible for. And the expansion of the number of directives coming to the principal didn't expand the time of day the principal had. So again, another thing we learned is that, systems in the routine operation are already demanding that people do basically a full day's work. So when a new initiative comes in, you tend to look at your own communication and say, well, I'm saying this, why aren't they hearing? But you don't realize there's lots of other background communication that's going on that the leadership of the school and the teachers have to be responsible for. So it was a really important learning, both about the way in which the state can communicate innovative reforms and the limitations of that mode of communication and really achieving the behavior change that you need, and the recognition that in these systems, just adding more directives doesn't expand the capability or capacity of the people to do new things. And so there has to be a very explicit prioritization in the communication, which again, I don't remember the exact numbers, but I've seen this study presented, and the directives were, over this course they traced them, were in the thousands. So you just get the sense of the pressure that the leadership and teachers were under day to day with compliance, and they naturally had always been compliant with these previous directives, and so we're a little not sure how they were supposed to expand to do new things. Next slide. So a very interesting part of again, embedded in the name of RISE is research into systems. And one of the hard things with doing research is that it's easier to track individual schools or individual students than it is to understand the system impact. And I think one study that illustrates this quite well is our Pakistan team did a study where they gave an unconditional cash grant to schools. So they had the universe of private schools that they had been working with a set of private schools in Punjab, Pakistan for a long time. And interestingly, they also had the universe of private schools. So by having been embedded and doing research for over a decade with private schools in Punjab, they knew every private school in the village. So it wasn't a new sample. They had a universe. They had a sample of villages, but then a universe of all private schools within the village. And this allowed them to do a randomized control trial with 2 treatment arms. One was to just give a grant to a given school and see what they did with it. And it was unconditional. There was no strings attached. It was, here's money, do whatever you feel like. Including, there was no, the owner of the school didn't have to spend it on the school. It was quite radically unconditional, right? Unlike most program designs, which have very narrow features of what the money has to be spent on. But then in the other treatment arm, they gave it to all the private schools in the village. And what this study really revealed how different it is to track what the impact of an intervention is if it's done on just one school versus if it changes the nature of the environment that the school is in. So when just one school got the grant, they upgraded visible inputs, and they upgraded visible inputs because they realized the other school couldn't afford to upgrade their visible inputs, and by upgrading visible inputs, they would attract more students to their school. So they bought desks, chairs, computers. And what happened is the school that got the grant got more students. But test scores didn't change for the treated school because they weren't investing in quality, because that was hard to document and hard to attract students on the basis of that. So they invested in visible inputs. And the rest of the schools, basically, since they didn't have a grant, didn't do anything. On the other hand, when you gave the grant to every school, it changed the way the school was thinking about how it could use the money to improve its own position. And they realized that, well, we need to compete in very different ways than just buying visible inputs. If we buy visible inputs and everybody buys visible inputs, well, we're no different than the other schools. So it actually changed. They were much more focused on upgrading things that improve quality. And in fact, one thing is they spent more on teacher wages. They actually went out and recruited teachers that were known to be better teachers and paid them. And since they were in short supply, the wages of teachers went up. And what this meant is the enrollment went up in the whole set of private schools, but moreover, the test scores went up in all of the private schools in the village, because they all now knew they had to attract students on the basis of not just visible inputs, but on actual learning performance, and hence completely changed the nature of the outcome. And in a way that, again, nearly all RCTs of this type wouldn't have been able to trace the system impact of having impacted what is being faced by all of the private schools in the relevant market, because a rural village in Punjab is kind of a closed education market. Every child is going to go to some school, either public or private, and they're going to choose a private school. So changing the financing across the system, changing this team also has a really interesting paper where you change the information content by providing to all schools and all parents the assessments of the schools. We see that system level changes can have dramatically changed the behavior of the way schools go about doing what they do in ways that can have radically different ways in which therefore schools compete, which lead to either upgrading on inputs in the individualized case or upgrading in a way that results in overall learning changes when it's a system level impact. So again, I think if I had to point to a single example where we can document for sure that there are, quite substantially different results of trying to do a program school by school versus doing the program in a way that self-consciously changes the milieu and context in which a school is operating by working on all schools. This is a really compelling piece of, while particular to its context and content, I think it's very compelling about there can be radically differences between school level interventions and scaled interventions across the system. Next slide. Another piece of research is that I think for some time people had been very concerned about about the disjunction and the incoherence in the system between what the curriculum was asking teachers and students to be able to do, what the classroom practices were actually focused on, and what the examination system was actually going to have high stakes assessment of students of what they could do. But to be honest, we didn't have particularly good data on this. I have a very old paper called The Negative Consequences of Overambitious Curriculum that was kind of theoretical and conjectural, but to be honest, wasn't very sophisticated about the empirical evidence. A couple of papers led by Julius and Michelle Kaffenberger actually did what is called a survey of the enacted curriculum. And they examined not just the coverage, which is on the vertical axis, what were the different topics that were intended to be covered, but also the depth of understanding or mastery that was expected from the teaching on those topics, ranging from the very basic kind of rote memorization in terms of depth of understanding to be able to analyze, explain, and apply this knowledge in a new novel context. So this way we can measure both kind of what is being covered and the sophistication that of understanding that is expected. And this graph, which Julius and Michelle have worked along to get it into, I think, this easily understandable form, because we're trying to convey both intensity along two different dimensions, is it illustrates, I think, really perfectly that the curriculum is expecting coverage of very high level concepts at very high levels of depth relative to what is actually going on in the classroom. The classroom is focused on very low levels of understanding of very few topics, but it's also very spread out across the topics. So rather than, in some sense, being spread out, and rather than being spread out horizontally, in which students acquire at least in-depth mastery of basics of the foundational topics, they rush ahead. So there is a lot of teaching time being devoted to covering topics also at a very superficial level. So you get a lot of the effort being going up in terms of topic coverage, but not a lot of the effort going out. So you see, even on the very fundamental skills, there's very little being pulled out to augment the depth with which students understand these things. And then you see the examinations are also not necessarily aligned with either of those two things. So many of the things that are emphasized in the curriculum are assessed, but many aren't assessed. The depth of the examinations don't necessarily get to the depth of the expectations of the curriculum. And the examinations are also kind of wildly out of line with where students are actually getting. So all of this just reveals that it's incredible, it's impossible with the level of incoherence between what is asked, what is done, and what is assessed, to think, what are we really as a system focusing on, and what are our true and realizable expectations for the depth of understanding students will emerge with across the level of topics. And I think this is really an important tool. This is one of the tools that we're now already replicating in a number of other countries. And this is a revelation even to the people in these systems, even the people who will work in these systems. They kind of understand the local reality, but they often don't understand the inconsistencies and incoherencies that are built into the system through the disjunction between a very ambitious curriculum for coverage and depth, the limited time and capability, and how are we going to distribute that between achieving mastery of foundational skills versus expanding coverage of topics, and how that relates to the incentives that students and parents and teachers feel about meeting. You can see that the examination covers very few topics, and you can see that therefore, if you were under performance pressure relative to examinations, you would change your teacher to focus on just a very few of the things that are actually intended to be covered by the curriculum. So again, this study, I think, is a radically a great visualization of a very important point that is confronting many education systems that we just, until we did this study, we just had no way of expressing this in concrete quantitative terms. Next slide. And now the second, and this aligns well with the previous study, a study used computer-aided instruction in Rajasthan, India, to examine how computer-aided instruction did or did not help student learning. And the content of the computer-aided instruction was that first, as the student came to the computer, there would be a series of diagnostic questions to diagnose the student's level of understanding. And then the computer would move the instruction to the student's current level of understanding and try and move the student forward from there. There were two big kind of findings from this. First, the light blue dots are the actual student mastery by grade, and the green line is the pace of the curriculum. And so what you see is that by grade 8, the grade 8 classroom consisted of children who, a substantial number of children who had grade 2 level understanding of mathematics, as well as some children that had a grade 8 understanding of mathematics. So if you had just taught the curriculum as designed, you would get very few of the classroom were actually at that level ready to understand and move forward. And a large number, and the average level in the classroom was grade 4. And the span of understanding of the classroom basically spanned the range from from grade 2 to grade 8. Then partly what that meant is the right-hand side is that if you then allowed the instruction to be tailored to the individual student level rather than teaching to the whole of classroom, you actually got quite significant learning gains from the computer-assisted instruction. And the important thing about this is relative to other computer-assisted instruction, this was in school. So you were displacing classroom time for computer time, and it was done at scale. So this was, I think, the first powerful evidence that at scale, in school, computer-assisted instruction that implemented teaching at the right level could have significant learning effects. And of course, the reason it could have significant effects is the understanding of this first graph, is students weren't being taught in an aggregate classroom, or couldn't in some sense be taught in an aggregate classroom, since the uniform, first of all, teaching just the curriculum would leave most students behind. Second, even if you taught to the reality of the average of the classroom, the heterogeneity in the classroom was so huge that you would have a very difficult time with non-individualized instruction reaching the students at the level they were at. And again, this is something that I think was kind of many people have come to similar conclusions and had similar intuitions about this, but I think this was by being able to produce actual estimates of the current understanding, I think radically pushed forward this agenda. Next slide. The second another study though is that we actually had we did several studies that did in-depth evaluation of teaching and learning practices. And one of the overall reasons why Vietnam was a country focus for RISE was that Vietnam, on the PISA and other international assessments, was on one level a very poor country, and at another level was achieving examination results the equivalent roughly of the UK or the US or other OECD countries. And part of the research was to examine actual, with videography and direct observation, document not just on average the practices in Vietnam, but what separated good teachers from bad teachers. I'm going to show a little clip which just shows a 40-second instance of a teacher teaching in Vietnam. So run the clip, Fred.
Đúng là vừa vào điều kiện Y làm trung trị qua B thì suy ra được A sẽ bằng. Như vậy cái kết quả của nhóm bạn Văn đưa ra đó đúng không? Kết quả của nhóm bạn Văn đưa ra đó đúng không con? Trí đang đợi chúng ta khen cả ấy thôi, chúng ta khen cả đó cho bạn Văn có tay. Tôi chuyển qua cái phần mới là có thấy bạn ấy hơi buồn buồn cho nên chúng ta cho cả có tay.
So the main finding of this study was that teachers that were producing excellent student results were engaged in encouraging metacognitive practices, that they were asking the students to be reflective learners so that they could explain not just the result, but explain how they got to the result and how they were thinking about the result. Whereas the classrooms in Vietnam, which were still ordered and by global standards good classrooms, weren't as engaged in the metacognitive practices. So you can see that they're not just moving, it's not just teacher instruction, they're relying on student input, and the student input, and although you can't get that unless you speak Vietnamese, they documented the importance of metacognitive practices. Now, the second, next slide. And I'm partly short on time and partly, well, I'm debating whether to show this because this is just so heartbreaking. But if you look at classrooms, same videography of classrooms in Brazil, you see not only were there not sort of sophisticated metacognitive practices being reflected in the teaching, but that there was very few students who were actually paying attention to what was happening in the classroom. And the important thing from this study was that these differences in, so let's show a little of the clip. Now I can't tease you and not show it, I guess. So Fred, why don't you? And I want to emphasize this wasn't a cameraman dropping in and distracting them. There was just a camera placed, and there was agreement and voluntary participation by all. But the classroom just randomly scanned the classroom for hours. And what it documented is that not only was how much time on task was there really on learning in these classrooms, and it documented just extraordinarily low levels of time on task and extraordinary heterogeneity even within schools in the same classroom. So let me, the last study the last is sort of cheating. I said 10 studies, but this is 4 studies around a similar theme. One of the things we tried to bring to a level of a system is our articulation of what a system means. A system of education is not just the Ministry of Education and not just the school. It's embedded in a political context, it's embedded in a social context, it's embeddedness, and it's the relationships between the politics, the organizations, the frontline teachers and principals, the parents, both as citizens of the larger state and as the direct participants and in the schools, students and their parents. We characterize the system, and then we characterize the relationship among these actors in terms of relationships of accountability. And what we emphasize is that a lot of times there's a disjunction in the power and accountability of the relation of the system, and there are often incoherences between what the teacher is hearing that they should do through the organizational channel of the bureaucracy they work for, and the ability of the parents or students to reflect their own local needs. So, and often in modern schooling systems, you have a very bureaucratic, process compliant sort of system that is controlling teachers, and that system tends not to be open to or listen to the needs, wishes, and wants of local communities and teachers. So there were 4 studies, one of school-based management in Nigeria by Masuda Bano as part of some qualitative work under the political economy of implementation. And she found that the implementation of school-based management committees was largely a charade. The government officials implementing this reform at the behest of the donors were going through the motions, but they were doing this precisely in their own words and views to distract the donors from focusing on more important parts of the dysfunction of the system. And so, you know, one would find that these committees had very little impact, but the reason they had very little impact is the system never really took them seriously at all. A second is part of the political economy of adoption. There was a very interesting, again, qualitative survey of the tensions between the local politicians and the bureaucracy about the choice and placement of teachers, in which the bureaucracy was focused on placing teachers who were meritocratically hired according to an examination. The difficulty is that examination had very little bearing on whether the teacher was willing to show up and actually be present and teach in the rural setting to which they assigned. And the local politicians were saying, look, giving us good teachers who don't come doesn't do us any good. Let us hire local villages who might not be able to meet the meritocratic standard of your bureaucracy, but who are at least willing to be in our village and teach. And it's a really excellent expression of the tension between different ways of organizing and thinking about how a system should work. There were other two studies, one in Malawi and one in Nigeria. The one in Nigeria was looking at why parents were sending their children to the Islamic schooling rather than the available in the village public schools. And what emerged was that many of the parents were concerned that the government school was really no better at conveying the formal learning of foundational literacy and numeracy, and yet conveyed implicitly a message of disrespect to the parents, to the community, to the religion that their parents valued. And hence, you know, in the words of one of the parents, it's like the government school is not preparing them through any learning. Even if it were preparing them, it's preparing them for jobs that don't exist in our context. And what they really learn is to disrespect us. Why would I ever send my child to that school? So the real gap between the reality of the bureaucracy and the reality of the parents' reality, and the incoherence of the school wasn't really embedded in the community in a way that evokes support. Let me show my final slide. Next slide. And so those are just, again, I'm just trying to convey the richness, depth, subtlety, range of methods, range of countries, range of topics, but each of which I think there's an important learning there. There's something learned from research that we couldn't have known unless we had gone in and actually done the work. A lot of these findings aren't common sense. You can't just have intuited your way to them. A lot of these findings aren't and so I think I have not made an attempt to summarize or synthesize the policy messages. Those are reflected in this. We have those reflected in a policy brochure and a set of toolkits for implementing these policy-based messages, which are a different way of synthesizing it. And so I'm not going to talk about how we synthesize the policy messages as policy messages, as opposed to presenting the individual pieces of research as pieces of research, but we have also attempted to synthesize in that way. So let me stop there.
Brilliant. Thank you. That was a great presentation. Lots of food for thought. And actually a lot of questions have come up from our audience. So I'm going to do my best to navigate the questions that have come in. What I thought is I'll just ask you sort of 3 questions that are coming up related to some of the studies that we all presented, and then I'm going to flip to a few questions that are sort of on wider issues and reflections, if you don't mind. So to kick off, some interest in the sort of flattening trends. So a couple of questions linked to that. You know, you showed the trend in Indonesia. Just wondering if there are studies from other settings that are also seeing the same thing. You know, how widespread is this as a phenomena? Well, and clearly you've mentioned the findings from Zambia as well. And then a question linked to the flattening that you saw in Zambia and Indonesia. Does that reflect a deterioration in learning, or do you think it could be associated with the expansion of enrolment to new populations who previously wouldn't have attended school? And related to that, do we know how Vietnam managed to expand access while still delivering on learning?
So first, we have some few other countries that have reliable data over time. So India, for instance, there's an organization called Pratham that has been doing a study called ASER, which is a very basic assessment of literacy and numeracy. It also has shown a substantial shifting inward, where students at each grade have less competence over time, over the course of about 10 years. Yeah, and this was all pre-COVID. So this Indonesia is not unique, but one of the reasons I'm highlighting this study is we have so few, many examination systems are meant just to compare the people sitting the exam at a point in time and are not really comparable over time in a reliable way. So yes, we have other instances in which we're showing deteriorating learning profiles, even in an environment of rapid expansion in spending per pupil, but not many. That's in some sense why we're highlighting this one. On the other hand, in the graph, I just showed Vietnam and Zambia, but that average bar, there are 60 some different countries. So I can show a much more complicated graph with the arrows for each of 60 countries, which is helpful because on the question of whether it's just expansion, it in some level, it obviously, as you bring new learners in, it's a challenge for the education system. But when we look across the 50 some countries for whom we can track performance over long periods of time, we don't see any association between the magnitude of the expansion and the change in learning. So it's not the case that consistently countries that expanded access the most had the biggest learning falls. And so while there are pressures from expansion, it's clear that lots of countries have done the same magnitude of expansion and had increased learning, and other countries have done similar expansion, had stagnating learning. Other countries have done similar expansion and had significant deteriorations. So the overall pattern is not suggestive that expansion is the cause of this deterioration, because there was no correlation between the magnitude of the expansion and the magnitude of the deterioration at all. And I have a blog that kind of documents that. And in addition, the researchers did obviously think of, oh, well, this is just bringing in new learners. And so they did a variety of ways of trying to eke out by looking at, for instance, just the socioeconomic advantaged who were already in school and are always in school. So there wasn't an expansion. And that deterioration was pretty similar, which is why I think the pairing of the two studies that look at within it, the elite of Zambia are getting a really, really globally mediocre education. And so it's not the case that even if we look at the children who would have always been in school, that their learning stayed the same. It also deteriorated at roughly the same pace. So we've done, the researchers have done a variety of ways to be sure that this isn't just an artifact of expansion. And again, I think the most powerful point is lots of countries had similar expansions with radically different improvements, stagnations, or deteriorations in learning. So it's not lockstep.
Great, thanks. And I mean, just your explanation to me just illustrates the importance of, rigorous research, that digging into the depth of really trying to understand what's going on versus simply interpreting a simple trend. Okay, yeah. A couple of questions linked to specific studies. So one about the Rajasthan study, and a question of, was the key driver of the positive results the fact that it was computerized? And, an interest in whether, it would have been different if it was in person. And then a question around the system shock finding in Pakistan, and an interest in that the issue around actual learning performance and the relative performance of schools. Surely that's something that tends to be invisible to parents. And so a question about, did the villages also have a school report card intervention in place? Were they able to see the outcomes of their children's learning, and did that influence what was seen in terms of the result?
So I think the first question is super important. I don't think the study itself can address it because it was hard enough doing an RCT with just the treatment arm of computer assisted instruction. And so but my own personal feeling is the answer is no. And the reason I have that feeling is we have similar types of personalized instruction of the rubric teaching at the right level that have been implemented without computers. Pratham, again, this NGO in India, there is a randomized control trial of a very early Pratham intervention, which basically did a simple diagnostic of reading, pulled the children with very low reading levels out of the classroom for several hours a day for, teaching at the right level, reading instruction by volunteers. And that study also showed similarly large increases in student learning. So I don't think the issue is computerized. I think the issue is how do you individualize instruction, and that's going to involve some element of assessing where the student is and some element of being able to individualize instruction. So I think it happens to be implemented in a computerized version in this particular case, and it illustrates that it can be done with a computer, but I don't think it's essential that it be done with a computer, because what the computer is doing can be done by human beings as well. It's just assessing the student's current level and then adapting the instruction to that. And again, we now have dozens at least of different variants of teaching around at the right level around the world, many of whom show similar or in some cases even larger impacts from non-computerized versions. So this is not a sell on tech. It's not that the tech was essential. I think it's a conceptual approach and this was just a test of can a computerized, can software actually embed this and implement this? And the answer is yes. That doesn't mean it's the best way or the cheapest way or the most cost-effective way. It just is our way. And I'm much more interested in it being a demonstration. It does produce these very striking ability to tell you where each student is and what each student's progress was. Now, the system shock, and I had, choosing just 10 of the many papers, I could have done an entire presentation with 10 completely different studies, and I hope at least it would have been just as interesting and compelling. One of the other studies of this same Pakistan country research team, which by the way is a research team that was part of RISE but had pre-existed and been working as on schools in Pakistan before this, which was an information intervention in which they just went into treatment villages. And again, instead of just revealing the scores of a particular school, revealed the scores of all the schools, and to the parents, the score of their child relative to the school and then relative to all other schools. Now, the interesting thing is they did that study 10 years ago, and one of the things RISE funding allowed them to do was to go back and resample the villages that had participated in the information study something like 10 years ago. And what they found amazingly was there were persistent effects. The treatment villages that had gotten this dissemination of information intervention 10 years ago were still significantly higher learning outcome villages than the control villages from 10 years ago. So what I think the system shock did is it changed the nature of how parents and schools were thinking about their choices. And then even without the continuation of the specific intervention, it continued to play out. So I think I'm half dodging the question, but saying, I think the conceptual point is important. I'm not saying that a system-wide unconditional cash grant is the best shock and information shocks, but I am saying that these types of shocks change the way that both suppliers of education and parents and students as demanders of education think about it in ways that often then persist and have very long legs.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on to some questions now coming in about sort of wider RISE questions. So first one is, can you just give us your favorite example maybe of impact on an education system that RISE has achieved? So something that you know, isn't about the paper, but it's really how a study or a body of work has affected the delivery of education in the real world.
So, so our long-run theory of change is ultimately, if it doesn't change in the classroom, it's not going to manifest itself in student outcomes. The RISE program recognized that it takes a long time to get to the point to change actual classroom behavior, and over even the 8 years of RISE, we weren't going to get there. Where we were going to get within RISE was countries recognizing the need to focus on learning. We were going to get to countries recognizing the need to get the instruction to the level of the student, and countries recognizing that they're going to need to align elements of the system, and by elements of the system, how are teachers hired, how are teachers trained, how are teachers evaluated, etc. So I think on all three of those points, there have been both globally and national examples of very significant change. So if you look at India's current government adopted education strategy, it's radically night and day more learning focused than it would have been. And I was living in India almost 20 years ago than it was or would have been 20 years ago. And again, you know, one of the, as the research director at RISE, I want to say to questions like this, I can show you impacts or I can show you individual studies, but trying to draw that causal chain is necessarily going to be hard, and I don't necessarily want to do it. RISE is a single part of a much larger movement within the global education community, so I don't want to claim that this RISE study caused the government of India to do this or that, but I can point to the national strategy of the government of India and show how it's radically different in terms of its emphasis on learning. Tanzania, one of the RISE countries, has adopted a radical change of the curriculum in the early grades in order to put more focus on early learning, foundational literacy and numeracy. You know, I don't want to, you know, draw a direct causal, simple chain from RISE participation to this change, but this is the kind of change. And we do have a RISE study showing that this greater focus in the early grades, simplifying the curriculum to put more focus on early gains in literacy and numeracy, has had significant learning impacts. Indonesia has had major changes in the way they're thinking about and implementing teacher training as a result of a long-term engagement with our RISE Indonesia country team that had one whole module, and I didn't even get to mention any of these studies that looked at the challenge of the ineffectiveness of the teacher training modalities in Indonesia. So I think country by country, and then as you said in your introduction, if you look at, you know, the transforming system, the transforming education summit this September of last year, I think it had already had a radically different agenda in ways that acknowledge the importance of systems, acknowledge the importance of addressing the learning crisis, that without this broader movement, it wouldn't have been there. So a metaphor, we have this wonderful Japanese wood carving of a giant wave, and we say that RISE isn't just a drop in the ocean because it's part of a wave. I think RISE has always conceived itself as part of a research and intellectual research part, an academic research part of this general wave in global discourse and in national education systems to focus on these three things of focus on learning, focus on prioritization of foundational learning, and particularly push to, focus on the early grades where these learning profiles often fail early, and the acknowledgement of need for system change.
Thanks. And yeah, I appreciate that. That's always that horrible question, isn't it, about attributability as a donor? We always ask that, but clearly systems of change are really complex. Many factors ultimately influence how a government might shape and change and evolve its education system. But our sense is that evidence has really contributed. So we feel very proud of that. Next question, there's two more questions. At FCDO, we, in an ongoing way in our commitment on education, is trying to think about how we support evidence-based interventions. So we've got things like the smart buys, which is that sort of synthesis of evidence, for example, and how it could be introduced to new contexts. You've highlighted the importance of adaptation and so on. Just any tips for education advisors who will be dialing in today about how they engage, and should it be thinking about how to engage in policymakers or working with other donors when they're trying to borrow that learning and bring it into the conversations with partner governments? So
I wear multiple hats as an academic, and one of them has been the research director of RISE. I also work on a research agenda called Building State Capability that has a method for helping government agencies to improve their capabilities, and it's called problem-driven iterative adaptation. And it is about precisely how to, work with governments to build over time their own capabilities to solve problems. And I think the most important thing I would say is if you start from the SMART 5, that's technical advice on what would, if implemented with fidelity, work. And that's super valuable. But then you have to ask the question of how works, not just what works, but how works. And I think the first bullet of that very last slide I showed of commit is the way in which is the thing that is often skipped over, and it builds reform efforts on a very narrow foundation. So what I mean is the important first step is problem construction. Until it's a locally internalized, acknowledged, and shared problem among all of the relevant actors, both authorizers and implementers, it's going to be very difficult to implement the SMART 5 with fidelity. And so I think oftentimes in practice, we're so rightly and justifiably anxious to get on with it that we skip over, have we actually is there a real true commitment to working this problem? And, I think the scary thing about this MP Madhya Pradesh study is that this intervention could have easily been a SMART 5 intervention. And yet it would have, without having taken the time to build the local ownership and the local commitment, it just wasn't going to work as planned. So I think if I had one thing to say, I would say, take the time to build the consensus and sharedness of the problem before rushing to implement the solution. And I'm not doubting that there's, good technical reasons why, I think you might have noticed I underemphasize in some sense the evidence about specific pedagogical interventions at work in favor of this recognition that until the system recognizes and shares the need and drive to achieve those results, I think you're going to have a very hard time getting those implemented with fidelity. And tragically, many of the existing RCTs done in education find little to no results, even of things we know for sure in principle because they have worked in other contexts can work. And I think create the shared commitment and purpose and drive around addressing specific things it takes time, it's hard, it's often, difficult to work through the the generation of consensus. Generation of consensus starts from lack of consensus, which is sometimes awkward to probe. But I think taking the time to do that is really essential.
Great, thanks, and very wise words and advice.
Sorry, Charlotte, can I just say, I say this, and this is, you know, we had our Vietnam team, and one reason we had the Vietnam team to learn what was it Vietnam did, and I was in one meeting a few years ago with the Vietnam team and pressing them, well, okay, you guys have told me a lot of what the Vietnam team did is show a lot of things it wasn't. You know, it wasn't spending, it wasn't the particular measurable thin inputs, it wasn't the background of the students. And I said, yeah, but what is it? And finally, Kane Rolliston, who's a British teaches education at UCL, said, Lant, they succeeded because they wanted to. And you know, I realize that taxpayers, you know, I hope taxpayers don't feel cheated by that answer, but that's an answer with a lot of traction, because often we skip over that. We assume they want to, or we hope they want to, and move straight to, well, if you want to, this is what you should do. But really, we shouldn't ignore that people succeed because they want to, and systems succeed because they want to, and that commitment is really essential.
Yeah, and a really important point. I was struck by the videos you showed as well about, in many areas, there's an essence of the individual, but they want to teach. They're as well, that can be hard for us to quantify in research studies that we do. We've got more questions, but we've run out of time, I'm afraid. So I'm going to wrap up now. But just to say thank you. It's a brilliant talk. I just want to thank all the participants as well for all their thought-provoking and great questions. I hope we've covered a fraction of what came in, but I think, you know, just shows how much interest there is in the RISE work and all of the lessons that are coming from that. I can see all the claps coming up. I mean, sadly, this is the last webinar of the RISE program. We continue, though, to as FCDO, to value and recognize the importance of education. It's important for our education advisors. We will be drawing on this research in the work that we do. We continue to be committed to supporting the generation of rigorous evidence linked to education, but also broader agendas around women's empowerment. And the sorts of research that we will be supporting includes on early childhood education, the role of education technology, and also doing more work around provision of education in crises. All the areas that have been shaped by the work that of RISE. We'll also have an FCDO What Works Hub for global education, which will have a specific role in sustaining the impact and legacy of the RISE programs. And once we mobilize it, it will manage the RISE community of practice and RISE website, which we hope will sustain the momentum of the campaign around the importance of foundational learning and ensure that the tools and diagnostics developed by RISE will become part of core practice that everybody uses in support of partner countries and educational systems. So I'll end there, but just to continue, everybody who's dialed in to engage on these issues, to link up with the community of practice, and to make sure that you're really digging into the RISE tools and resources. And there's lots of links that I've seen got on the chat. So with that, I'll hand back to Michelle.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that. And thank you both for the great discussion and digging in a bit deeper here in the Q&A portion. And I just want to say thank you to all of our participants for joining us today. Thank you to Professor Watts for chairing for us, and to Lant for the great presentation and the discussion. Just to note that we'll post the recording for this. So if anyone had to step away or something, it'll be posted on the RISE website sometime soon. And thank you to everyone. Take care.